Hey, so keeping in my theme of historical puzzles, historical question marks, I made that video earlier about who really was the first American president. Here's another interesting historic question I think is worth discussing. How often have you heard the expression 5,000 years of Chinese history? Or China is a land or a country with 5,000 years of history? Now, this raises a lot of question marks for anyone who studied basic history in terms of dynasties. Then this automatically raises a question mark. The first historically confirmed dynasty in Chinese history was the Shang Dynasty, which was thought to have begun in northern China above the Huanghe River around 1600 BC, using the Western calendar in terms of that chronology, around 1600 BC. Now, that is considered to be the first historically authentic dynasty because it is the first dynasty for which written records can be verified. There is one preceding dynasty, the Xia dynasty, which goes back to about 2070 BC. But even Chinese historians sort of see that as semi-legendary. The Xia dynasty has a huge part to play in the Chinese creation myth and the whole concept of the establishment of the Middle Kingdom that was used later under the Han unification process, um, and certainly by the Yellow Emperor and others. Um, but this concept of 5,000 years definitely raises eyebrows because, or it should raise eyebrows, because if you do the math there, 1600 BC brings you back 3,600 years roughly. Even if you consider the Shia dynasty to be historic, something most historians agree was not the case because it's based on legends, a bit like our Arthurian legend here in the UK. Um, it goes back, like I say, 2070 BC, that's about 4,080 years. Yet 5,000 years is bringing back a whole millennium before that. Now, as a first point to consider, there's no question about it. China is a very ancient land with a very long history. I don't think anyone would dispute that. So some might say, well, what does it really matter if people are saying 5,000 years as opposed to 3,600 years? Actually, it does matter because by presenting this unique history of 5,000 years, I think what the Communist Party is doing is saying that we have a unique status. Actually, if we consider history be the establishment of writing, then both Egypt and Mesopotamia predate China by at least a millennium. The Indus Valley civilization is another big competitor for one of the earliest civilizations in present day India and Pakistan, the Indus Valley, which is around modern day Karachi and Sindh, Baluchistan provinces, and the Punjab. Within China, this is not to say that there wasn't significant history before 1600 BC. Of course, there was. There have been oracle manuscripts, have been examples of bone fragments. There have been examples of very early writing. But if we consider history to be the establishment of a civilization, how do we consider civilization? Well, usually it involves a sophisticated urban culture rather than being hunter gatherers or nomadic peoples. Therefore, that's why the Shang Dynasty, where you have a clear hierarchy, you have a king, you have a political system, you have urbanization. That's civilization. I think most people would agree with that. So, what that comes down to is China is not quite as ancient as is often made out to be. I think this is a good example of a sort of sinocentrism that the Communist Party has long been promoting, and it's this idea that I think there's a lot of political, geopolitical aspects to this. Um, it's well known that the Chinese Communist Party is incredibly sensitive to outside criticism. So I think this is this kind of sinocentric attitude that, oh, how dare these pesky Europeans or these pesky Americans criticize us when we have such a long history. So they use this 5,000 year mantra as a way to justify that. Now the follow up question is, where does the 5,000 year mark come from? Why not 6,000 years or 4,000 years? I may be wrong about this, but I think it comes from mistranslations in some early archaeological finds. There's a very interesting article I'm reading. I've just read actually in preparation for this video, and it's an expert excerpt, excuse me, from the book "You Don't Know China" by John Ross, and he raises a lot of points actually about Sinocentrism and this attitude. Even back in the 18th century, when Britain had went to China to open up trade deals. This was before the Opium Wars. The Chinese emperor at the time basically turned the British away because he saw us as foreign barbarians. There was very much an ethnocentric, specifically Sinocentric attitude in the Middle Kingdom for many years. So, whilst China had that century of humiliation, what is less often reported is that China had a real arrogance for centuries before that. Now, you could argue every great power has, um, but I think the constant mantra of 5,000 years of history needs to maybe be challenged because it is something that is frequently used for political reasons. Ostensibly, you'll just see it in ads about tourism and so on, which is sort of harmless, although it's inaccurate. But when it is used for Chinese exceptionalism, that then becomes problematic because it is saying we deserve a unique status because we're so ancient. Firstly, there are older civilizations. Secondly, it is a flawed figure because of what I said. Um, Even Chinese historians agree that the first historically authentic civilization, that is one that has actual concrete historical evidence, was the Shang Dynasty. Still very ancient, still very impressive, but, and that's the point actually, it's something that John Ross says. Because China has such a long and rich history, it's not necessary to embellish it. It's not necessary to exaggerate that 3,600 years still is very impressive. It's still very ancient. So there's really no need to add it up to 5,000 when that simply isn't the case. And like I say, how we define history is very important. Here in the British Isles, I mean, if we're being really taking the definition of history to a certain logic, then I could argue that Britain has 7,000 years of history because the earliest foundation stones around Stonehenge go back to 5,000 BC. Now, I think most people would agree Britain doesn't have 7,000 years of history in the sense that we know it. It's had millennia of human occupation, so was China, so was much of the world with the out of Africa theory. But how history is defined as opposed to prehistory is very, very important. And I think most people would agree it is the time when civilization starts to develop, the time when you start getting written manuscripts, the time when you have a sophisticated society rather than just hunter gatherers and nomadic peoples moving around. Therefore, let's start saying China has 3,600 years of history, which is, in my opinion, still very impressive. I don't think it denigrates China as a country. But that's another point. China as a country itself is a problematic term. Of course, today the People's Republic of China is a country, but China actually was unified under Qin Shi Huang in around, I believe it was around 100 BC, 150 BC, somewhere around. Don't quote me on that, but it was somewhere around that mark. um, Long after the Shang Dynasty. Actually, a lot of the history of China is one of petty kingdoms fighting off against each other. Um, and that is, in a way, what in my line of thinking makes it even more interesting. I mean, China is a fascinating country. If you've never been there, I strongly recommend it. Purely from whatever your political views are, it's purely from a history point of view, it is fascinating. And I don't think challenging this 5,000 year figure takes away from that. But I do think it is used. For partly, at least partly political reasons. It's a way of Chinese officials of saying we're exceptional, so you can't criticize us. And a lot of Westerners have parroted this line. Media executives, even ex-presidents, Richard Nixon didn't use the 5,000 years, but he did say it was an ancient land. Um, I take a dim view, incidentally, when the Communist Party of all people has the audacity to say we are wise, we have a long history. Having a long history doesn't make you right or wrong. In fact, it is the Communist Party that was responsible for destroying much of Chinese history during the Cultural Revolution. So they're really in no position to sort of play the wise old sage who can, you know, preach to the pesky Europeans and Americans, the ignorant Westerners, about a long history. Probably of all the countries in the world, the country that has the strongest claim to civilization is probably Iran. Because if we look at the Uruk, Iran, Iraq, looking at ancient Sumeria, is ancient Mesopotamia, they probably have the strongest claim. Egypt, China, the Indus Valley civilization are all very ancient. But I think if we look at it in terms of the furthest back historiography, then we're looking at the Fertile Crescent in the Near East and Iran, Iraq. I personally find China fascinating, but it's more like 3,600 years of recorded history as opposed to 5,000 years. Doesn't mean that, China doesn't have human stories going back long before that. Of course it does. But this is something that needs to be discussed. Okay, incidentally, I would like to know where the 5,000 year mark comes from. I speculated there that it was from archaeologists had missing. I may be wrong about that. I concede I may have been wrong about that, but certainly the historiography only goes back 3,600 years. So I'd be interested to know where this comes from. If anyone has the answer, I'm all ears.